Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today, we are going to be discussing the form of the first movement of Mahler's First Symphony in D major, nicknamed Titan. To begin, let's quickly place Mahler in the timeline of history. He was born in Bohemia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in 1860. During his lifetime, he was mainly known as a conductor, but in the last decade of his life, he began to experience acclaim as a composer as well. Unfortunately, this brief period of success, which continued after his death in 1911, was cut short by the rise of fascism in Europe. Peter Franklin, writing in the Grove Dictionary, has this to say: "Only during the last decade of his life did they, the symphonies, begin to enjoy the critical support and popular success that helped to ensure the posthumous survival of his reputation as a composer beyond the years of National Socialism, Nazi rule, in Germany and Austria." Mahler suffered the fate of innumerable band composers of Jewish origin at a time when his music was still imperfectly known and understood outside the German-speaking countries of Europe. The centenary of his birth in 1960 inspired the popular rediscovery of his symphonies, particularly in England and the USA, where they rapidly gained a young and enthusiastic audience. Although the compositional origin dates for the First Symphony are hazy, it seems the bulk of it was composed in 1888. But it was near the final, compositionally successful period of Mahler's life that the First Symphony was finally published, and in some ways, completed. The initial 1889 premiere of the symphony was so lukewarm, at best, that Mahler took to revising this piece both shortly after that premiere and again before publishing it in 1899. The majority of Mahler's changes to the work involve orchestration and the complete excision of the original second movement called Blumine. My score, and the score I will use in this analysis, are recreations of the originally published 1899 score. Although the symphony was initially programmatic, and Mahler had written a fairly detailed accounting of that program, Derek Cook, in a liner note for this symphony, writes that he, Mahler, actually detested all programs and eventually withdrew those of his first three symphonies. Despite this eventual withdrawal of the program, it's unusual to read an analysis of these works that don't somehow involve them. And I don't mean simply in a narrative sense. I mean outright reference to the withdrawn program. I'm not casting any aspersions here. I don't have a problem with engaging with the original program. But if only to shake things up, in my analysis, I intend to, more or less, eschew the original program in favor of simply analyzing the music available, and therefore, in a small way, maybe appreciate the music the way Mahler might have hoped it would be experienced. There is text, both directional and descriptive, written in the score by Mahler, and I will occasionally be engaging with that, perhaps most often in the introductory section. The recording throughout the video is George Schulte's 1964 recording with the London Symphony Orchestra. The score is marked wie ein Naturlaut, like a sound of nature. But I think even without that indication, the primordial, generative nature of the music can scarcely be denied. The first musical reference that came to my mind was the opening music of Das Rheingold, in which Wagner attempts to create the world. But the opening of Haydn's oratorio, The Creation, a representation of the Christian God creating the world, also comes to mind. The initial 7 octaves of A, almost entirely harmonics except in the third group of basses, creates the musical equivalent of a void, into which the initial motive of a descending fourth first appears. Emphasizing this space as one of creation, the motive quickly expands into a descending chain of fourths. What the musicologist Konstantin Floros in his book Gustav Mahler, The Symphonies, calls the nature theme, and Byron Ullman in his book on musical narrativity notes, a descending fourth undergoes repetition in various octave registers and then expands into a cascading succession of intervals that gradually descends to fill an octave span. That the descending fourth is generatively fundamental to Symphony No. 1 is shown by A.P. Brown, who notes its significant constitutive function in themes and accompaniment patterns in every movement. A.P. Brown is the author of the Symphonic Repertoire No. 4, the second golden age of the Viennese Symphony. That the motive of a fourth, descending or ascending, is the point of germination for almost all the melodic material in this movement can scarcely be denied. I will therefore simply refer to it as the seed. As the world begins to be created around the first A, Mahler dips into other areas to foster a sense of primordial creation. The tonal center of the opening is initially undefined. Although we know the symphony to be in D major, the initial key signature of 1 flat indicates either F major or D minor, or potentially A Phrygian, the mode with flattened 2nd, 6th, and 7th scale degrees. My analytical preference is to simply view this entire area as a minor 5 chord in the key of D minor. You sometimes see a minor 5 chord in Brahms music. It can be used to emphasize the struggle of creating actual dominant to tonic motion. Likewise, the material which follows the seed, this fanfare in the clarinets, can be viewed as the flattened 2nd scale degree in A Phrygian, or, as I view it, it can be the major 6 chord in D minor, creating a kind of deceptive cadential motion, minor 5 to major 6, all taking place under a dominant pedal. Minor 5 is eventually reinstated through a brief chromatic line in the bass voices and thirds leaping upward in the oboe. Floros divides this section into tempo sections of alternating più mosso and tempo 1, but the theorist Seth Monahan in his book Mahler's Symphonic Sonatas labels them as subrotations, which I think is better nomenclature for what's happening, given that each section is opened with the same seed. However, I've chosen to label each of the sections, which do correspond with Monahan's, as episodes. I've done this because I think of rotations as being related to the initial ordering of themes, or in this case, motives, which appear in an initial referential layout. In the case of a sonata form, the exposition. But in the case of this opening section, each of the episodes is not rotational, in the sense that it both does not move through the individual themes introduced in the initial episode, and new motivic material continues to be generated in each of the episodes. Let's move on to episodes 2 and 3, and I think you'll see what I mean. In this section, the primordial A begins to move into its own as an actual dominant chord, Still without a third, perhaps referencing medieval harmony, the trumpets sound an open fifth, A and E, which moves into a fanfare on a D major chord, a more substantial and, we might even say, tonally correct version of the awakening fanfare originally heard in the clarinet choir. Although tonally and melodically distinct from one another, they are linked by their location after the seed motive and by both being fanfares. Episode 2 we might call a rotation or subrotation, but Episode 3 throws a wrench in that. After more descending fourths, labeled by Mahler as being imitative of a cuckoo, an entirely new theme enters the room. This theme is, as far as I can tell, not found anywhere else in this movement, making it somewhat of an oddity. Most analyses of this work seem to skip over it or mislabel it as being derived from one or the other of the two fanfares, which I really don't see at all. What I thought, and still think, is that this is a Wagner quotation, or at least a reference. In fact, I was so certain of this that I spent nearly half a day listening to playlists of Wagner's leitmotifs and sections of his operas. The closest I could come up with is a similarity between this theme in the symphony and the Valhalla and related Ring leitmotifs from Das Rheingold. As you can see, it's far from a perfect match, so if you have any other ideas, please let me know. But after this episode, the theme essentially vanishes. Whether it reappears in the following movements remains to be seen. What this theme definitely does accomplish is the creation of a much stronger tonal reality. It's difficult to now deny that the A is functioning as a dominant and D major as tonic. This is followed by another iteration of the awakening fanfare in trumpets before the seed. Again, acting as bird call, moves us into the fourth episode. The main feature of episode 4 is a chromatic sequential line. Ullmann, who labels this as motive 5, notes that a chromatic line, introduced by the low strings in measures 47 to 50, serves to premodalize the appearance of the Gesellen melody, more on that later, and the arrival of the exposition. The chromatic, as a signifying element, is topically associated with tension, pain, and foreboding. Here, its role is ambiguous. It foreshadows the finale of Symphony No. 1 with its infernal passages, but also, like a growing pain, initiates the build-up to the subsequent large-scale thematic statement. The germinal material of the introduction, then, is not entirely positive in character. Rather, it is amoral, beyond good and evil. The thematic material of the exposition, derived as it is from the high-style pastoral, is closer to this amorality through its association with nature. Although I might not personally label this section as motivic, I love Ullmann's idea of this representing the germinating nature and unfeeling amorality of the entire section. I feel that both musically and narratively, the music is seeking to escape this void and create the world that is the opening movement of this symphony. Now, finally, we've emerged from the primordial ooze of the introductory section and begin what I think we can fairly call the exposition. The main theme, what appears to be the primary theme, is obviously related to the seed motive of the descending fourth, but it's also a reference to an earlier work of Mahler's, the orchestral song cycle Lieder eines Fahrenden Gesellen, or Songs of a Wayfarer. That's right, we are stepping outside of symphonic and sonata analysis and into my show within a show, where I examine song cycles and occasionally individual lieder. The song this symphony takes one of its main themes from is Ging Heut Morgens übers Feld, or This Morning I Went Over the Meadow. You can see how it dovetails perfectly with the idea of nature and roaming through it. The recording I'll be using in this analysis is of Marilyn Horne in 1979, accompanied by Zubin Mehta leading the Los Angeles Philharmonic.
Ging heut Morgen übers Feld, da noch auf den Riesen hing, sprach zu mir der Lustgefink, ei du Geld. Guten Morgen, ei Geld, du, wir siehst eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt. Sieh, schön und flink, wie mir doch die Welt gefällt.
Obviously, the scale of what's happening is quite different from the symphony, but there is a similarity in the introductory dominant A that ushers in the main theme. In the song, we're hearing multiple perspectives. The initial voice, the narrator, if you will, is walking through a field in the meadow. She then meets a cheerful finch who speaks to her. It says, "Hey, good morning. Isn't it a lovely world?" The narrator neither agrees nor disagrees, but there are some indications of how she might feel even at this early stage. When the finch says, "Isn't it a lovely world?" the harmony is the opening tonic 6/4 of a cadential 6/4 progression, which instead of resolving to the dominant, moves to a 6 chord. In the following line, the finch sings that the world is lovely and bright. It loves the world. But again, under both of these lines, we have first an unresolved dominant preparation, followed by a dominant chord which, because of the addition of 7th and 9th, cannot really be called a half cadence.
Auf die Glockenblume am Feld hat mir lustig guter Ding, mit den Glöckchen klinge, kling, klinge, kling. Ihren Morgenruß geschellt, wir siehst eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt. Kling, 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 schönes Ding, wie mir doch die Welt gefällt, hey, ja.
With a near identical trajectory, in verse 2, the narrator spies the harebell in the meadow. A harebell is a type of flower. It's apparently sometimes called a bluebell, which is odd, as it seems to be purple, but what are you going to do? The harebell, again in quotation marks, in the text, if unfortunately not in the score, exclaims, "Isn't it a lovely world?" But again, each of these statements is heard over unresolving cadential gestures. As the verse ends, Mahler begins to move the harmony toward the submediant B, emphasizing first 3, F sharp major, and then the new tonic of B major. Although Mahler has chosen to move this into the major mode, the use of 6 rather than 5 or even 4 seems meaningful. In D major, modulating to 6 would typically mean a modulation into the minor mode, not the major. Perhaps the major mode is simply an illusion. We also are prevented from really feeling this as a cadence due to the dominant F sharp chord being in second inversion. Scale degree 2 in the bass moves into the tonic.
Alles tun und schöne Welt, ei du Geld, ei du Geld. Schöne Welt.
This time, we actually managed to reach something which we might call a half cadence. The narrator seems to be able to engage with the world around her. She sings that in the sunshine, the world begins to sparkle. She can experience the joy of the world around her as well. Or at least, she wants to. The flowers and birds sing, again in quotations, "Good day. Isn't it a lovely world? Don't you think so?" The interrobang seems a little more aggressive than is necessary, but the music is trying to make it work. An extended cadential 6/4 does resolve to a dominant chord. The final verse, however, begins with a reference to the dominant chords of the opening, now lower and substantially slower in the cello's repeated F sharp. The text of this verse reads, "Will my happiness begin now?" No, I think my happiness can never bloom. Although the song is sometimes analyzed as ending in F sharp major, Derek Cook labels it that way in his introduction to Mahler's music, I'm going to push back strongly against that idea. Although the main theme is now appearing around a perfect fourth, which begins on F sharp, the melody has been enervated and now falls downward for its final note rather than continuing to rise. On the second repetition of "Will my happiness now begin?", the winds and cellos attempt to re-emphasize the tonic of B major, pulling the narrator back toward the tonic. As the song comes to a close, first a secondary dominant of 5 and then eventually a whisper of a cadential 6/4, indicated by this B, which resolves to the third of the dominant in the F sharp major chord, eventually closes the song on a half cadence. The song, in my opinion, this is only my analysis after all, doesn't actually resolve to the tonic. As such, I would say this song is strongly in dialogue with a narrative archetype that we don't often see on the channel, often because it's so hard to pin down, that of irony. Byron Allman, in his text A Theory of Musical Narrativity, describes irony like this. Irony is a narrative of denial and subversion. It resists the comfortable convictions and illusions of the other archetypal forms, whereas romance has its quests, with its established stages and confrontations leading to reward and transformation. Irony shows us the meandering pointlessness and meaninglessness of such adventures. Allman goes on to say that irony, more than the other three archetypes, tends to sneak up on the listener. Cues to the presence of a narrative transgression are often hard to detect at first, as the music apparently unfolds a guileless discourse based on our conventional expectations. It is only later, when our expectations have been clearly subverted, that we can see to what extent this was both hidden and prefigured. Although you were cued into the encroaching irony by me as I took you through my analysis, I think it's extremely fair to say that as a listener, one might have two expectations, or perhaps the word assumptions is more appropriate, of this song. First, I don't think anyone listening to the text of this song for the first time would really suspect that the narrator is, apparently, miserable throughout the entire song. The text is so joyous, the music so harmonically simple, that I think the first three verses would lull almost anyone into a false sense of happiness. That sense is then subverted by the glass-shattering effect of the text and harmony of the fourth verse, which brings me to my final assumption, that the listener would assume the song would end with a tonic cadence. Although examples of non-resolving music do exist in the 19th century, it is extremely rare and shockingly deformative. I think, even to the ear, without a score, it is apparent that this music is not actually resolving. As we move back into Mahler's First Symphony, this narrative archetype of irony and a subversion of expectations will certainly appear again. But for now, let's hear the opening of the Exposition and discuss. Appearing, as this theme does, after the lengthy chromatic struggle that brought us out of the introductory section, the music of Ging Heut Morgens seems naive, actively moving over field and meadow with ease into A major. The reason I wanted to play the full exposition is, in the unlikely event that you aren't familiar with the piece, you were no doubt shocked to discover that this is, seemingly, a monothematic exposition. There are not two distinct themes. In fact, we are missing many of the normative elements of a sonata exposition. Arguably, there's no transition, medial caesura, or, apparently, secondary theme. What we do have are an essential cadence in measure 135, followed by a closing theme. I have some thoughts about both opening sections of this symphony, but for now, I want to return to the idea of irony and a subversion of expectations. Although this has no doubt changed in the modern musical world, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that calling your work a symphony creates the expectation in the 19th century listener's mind of a first movement in sonata form. But at the point of writing this symphony, the sonata form is approaching an age of 150 years or more. This is a huge swath of material upon which one is expected, even if the expectation is created only by oneself, to make some innovation upon. While a composer like Mahler cannot be said to approach this problem in only one way, I think it's fair to say that in this exposition, he has used our own expectations against us. By calling on the pastiche of what some, like Konstantin Floros, call a monothematic exposition, and what Seth Monahan calls a continuous exposition, Mahler has subverted our expectation of the traditional late Romantic sonata form. The generically obligatory primary theme, transition, medial caesura, secondary theme, essential expository closure, and closing theme, and chosen only a few of these sections for this exposition. As Allman said, quote, "Irony, more than the other three archetypes, tends to sneak up on the listener," end quote. It is really only when the expository repeat is engaged that we are sure this is not a typical exposition. Now, if you're a fan of the channel, and in this case, I know you are, since otherwise you wouldn't be seeing this, thank you so much for your patronage, by the way, you've no doubt noticed that I, a known labeling queen, have been curiously hesitant to really identify any of the sections of this exposition, except for the essential cadence and closing zone. If we are adhering strictly to the definitions provided by Hepikoski and Darcy in sonata theory, there really is no issue in the labeling of the first section of this work. I think it's fair to say they would call it a slow introduction. Even if, as you may have noticed, the music does make a brief return before the development begins. That is unusual, but also not unheard of. Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata comes to mind. There are, in fact, many aspects of the tonal and rhetorical goals of slow introduction that we do have in this section. It includes sequences, dramatically quiet material, calls to action, and, perhaps most importantly, a dominant preparation. We may also, and with absolutely no stretch to the imagination, view it as a representation of, quote, the world, condition, or field of implications within which the subsequent sonata form plays itself out, end quote. And that section is on page 300 of Sonata Theory. All that aside, though, it is my personal labeling and analytical preference to diverge with Hepikoski and Darcy here. I feel that if the motivic or melodic material found in a slow introduction appears within the sonata proper, if the introductory material is not atemporal, if the section interacts with the sonata form itself, that it not be labeled a slow introduction, but that it be labeled a zero module of some kind. Using the sonata theory term primary theme zero module, or my own term sonata zero, as I discussed in my video about Chopin's first ballade in G minor. It is the sonata zero term which I feel is most appropriate here, given the section's generative and germinating focus around the seed motive that forms the basis for all the themes to come. It is because of my view of this section that I haven't labeled the Wayfarer song theme that rushes towards cadence as primary theme, and why I feel that, although I would absolutely say that this movement is in sonata form, the exposition actually is not. Or rather, that it has failed in a serious way, a failure that is not even on the radar of the exposition. Having said that, however, I do feel that the generic goal of a sonata form, the essential cadence, is very much in play here. Seth Monahan writes, "Despite its schematic idiosyncrasy, the movement is absolutely straightforward from the standpoint of sonata process. Its tonal cadential trajectory could hardly be spotlit more emphatically. The exposition's 100-measure stringendo is aimed directly at a single cadence, the dominant key EEC in measure 135. As to specifically why I refuse to label anything in the exposition, to be honest, I didn't want to divulge any spoilies for the form. Let's continue into the development section. Now we come to the challenge, ignored in the exposition and brought into the foreground, a new theme in the cello, not heard before, but to my ear, and I, closely related both to the seed motive and the expanded bird call, what Floros calls the Terilli motif that was the main body of the closing zone. The pedal F natural, which follows this new theme, drops the floor out from under us and sends us reeling back into the D minor that was implied in the Sonata Zero section. We might reasonably view this return to the primordial gestations of nature as a commentary on the exposition which preceded it. All was not well. As the development continues, the cello theme representing again what Allman calls the amoral natural world will call forth the chromatic motive, which eventually brought the actual exposition into being. Ladies and gentlemen, a second theme has now hit the development. We have the cello music from the opening, and now this fanfare. I view both of these themes as a sort of premonition of a moment that's going to come later in the movement. It's especially relevant to notice that this theme appears out of an off-tonic section into the tonic of D major. I know I'm bringing in a record number of outside musical works to explain this symphonic movement, but I want to actually take this moment to discuss another famous work with a truly bizarre thematic entry mid-development, just to show how even sonata forms composed well over a century apart could potentially be in dialogue with each other. I'm not going to guide us through each individual moment of the sonata form, but as we listen to the first movement, attempt to locate the medial caesura. This is the exposition of the first movement of Haydn's Farewell Symphony No. 45. So, I was playing a little trick on you. There actually is no medial caesura in this exposition. It's continuous, an example of the Fortspannung type. Tragically so, actually. The initial Sturm und Drang theme in F sharp minor cycles into the desired A major mediant, but is unable to cadence, eventually collapsing into the dreaded dominant minor with a potential essential expositional closure here. Although it's debatable whether the music that follows negates it as a structural cadence, What's relevant here is that you might see a slight resemblance to the Mahler, in that they can both be called continuous monothematic expositions. Let's move to the development, and the connection will become even clearer. What we're particularly looking for is the rotational layout of this development. Because the exposition was continuous, the development should really only center around one theme. Now, perhaps the similarities are beginning to crystallize. The development in the Farewell Symphony is almost as if we are looking at an exposition through a mirror. The Sturm und Drang primary theme is now in A major, and it transitions into a medial caesura, and what would be a secondary theme. The desired secondary theme in the introduction appears in the major submediant. The theme cadences easily before the music retransitions to the recapitulation. Now, in the Haydn, unfortunately, the desired ephemeral secondary theme does not make an appearance in the recap. It was only a dream. But what will happen in the Mahler? As the primary theme that wasn't fades away, the development continues and becomes much more normative, cycling through keys without finding any secure footing. The cello theme, once primordial and amoral, is now in a lyrical major mode and ushers in material from Ging Heut Morgens. Leaving the ephemeral dream space of the two themes, the song of the Wayfarer that is the basis for this movement re-enters, ranging far and wide through D major, E flat minor, A flat major, C major, and finally approaching F and F minor, a key which has a somewhat darker context from the earlier pedal that thrust us into D minor. Byron Allman, in his analysis of this movement, discusses this section as prefiguring the events of measure 574 to 628 of the final movement, which the material in this section of movement 1 roughly parallels. The prefigured passage contains the pivotal phase in that conflict, culminating in the moment at which the home key is abruptly, and surprisingly, restored. The analogous passage from the first movement, characterized by an increase in dynamic level and gestural intensity, a shift of mode from minor to major, and the employment of an arrival 6/4, more on that later, depicts the moment that brings the hero into full consciousness and power. The previously muted and distant fanfares return in full force at the arrival of this moment, functioning as an annunciatory gesture. In many ways, this section is a strong foreshadowing of the form of the final movement, and as such, contains its own Mahlerian Durchbruch, or breakthrough, albeit on a somewhat smaller scale than the coming moment in the finale. My views on the, as Allman calls them, previously muted and distant fanfares will become clearer on the other side of the breakthrough, so buckle up, because it's all about to happen. Strikingly similar to the moment when the exposition arises out of the Sonata Zero module that opened the movement, the Durchbruch utilizes a technique identified by Robert Hatton in his book, Musical Meaning in Beethoven, which he calls the arrival 6/4, an expressively focal cadential 6/4 serving as resolution of the thematic or tonal instabilities, often with a Picardy third effect. He writes that it need not resolve to 5. Its rhetorical function may displace its syntactic function, at least locally. Although I do think the context of whether a cadential 6/4 resolves is likely to be pregnant with meaning, what I take away from this is that the resolution or failure to resolve an arrival 6/4 need not affect whether it is perceived as an arrival. In this case, however, the point is moot. After the heraldic awakening fanfares from Sonata Zero bring forth the cadential 6/4 arrival, Mahler does resolve the progression into the tonic of D major, and the primary theme that never was finally appears in its proper place. Theodor Adorno, in his book Mahler, A Musical Physiognomy, writes that in the First Symphony, which reveals but does not resolve the tension within Mahler's music, this is seen clearly. The recapitulation after the breakthrough cannot be the simple recapitulation formally required. The return that the breakthrough evokes must be its result, something new. To prepare for this musically, a new theme is evolved in the development, the melodic germ of which is introduced at the start in the cellos. From it, an episodic horn phrase is formed, and then it dominates the later development to emerge retrospectively, as it were, at the return of the tonic, as the main theme which, at the time, it never was. I didn't want to share this earlier because I didn't want to give the game away, but the idea that the fanfare-like theme, still related to the seed in Sonata Zero, note the descending fourth, is really, in my view, and also Adorno's, the primary theme of this movement. Either the exposition was aware of it and ignored it, or was blissfully ignorant of the norms of sonata form. The theme has broken through and takes its rightful place in the recapitulation, and in so doing, solidifies the ironic narrative archetype, at least in my mind. Remember, as Ullmann discussed in his book, in essence, irony reminds us of the unreality of our ideals, shatters our convictions, and throws aside our conventions. The ironic archetype portrays the defeat of an initial hierarchy by transgressive elements. Indeed, it is the very integrity of that hierarchy that is the focus of attention in ironic narratives. I think of an ironic archetype as being one in which not only are your expectations as a listener subverted, but it is also made clear to you that those expectations were really functioning like shackles around your interpretation. Something I feel that Mahler eventually became aware of when he decided to discard the programs for his first 3 symphonies. The expectation that a recapitulation be a, more or less, straightforward repetition of the expectation, but in the tonic key, is such a standard part of the sonata principle that we aren't even really aware of it as an albatross around the neck until, as in this work, the breakthrough creates the moment where our expectations both crystallize into glass and shatter before our eyes. James Buehler, in his article Breakthrough as a Critique of Form, writes that a breakthrough is a moment of structural reorientation, a deflection or turning aside from the expected formal course of a piece. It differs from simple interruption in having not just local, but also large-scale formal consequences. The opposite of tragic reversal or catastrophe, breakthrough is an unforeseen event, a sudden turn toward transcendence from an expected formal trajectory of tragedy. In short, a breakthrough is meant to entirely reorient us within the frame of the work. Not only does it change the trajectory of the music which follows, but it backfills the parts of the piece which we have already heard, making clear the function of music which, on first hearing, we simply experienced. Although not entirely normative, the layout of the recapitulation follows a more standard sonata layout. P1.1, the fanfare, and P1.2, based on a combination of Ging Heut Morgens music and the cello theme introduced in the development, move into a transition, which is easily recognizable as what was closing theme in the Exposition. Although this moment is far from the typical medial caesura, it does have a lot in common with that concept, including a successful cadential 6/4 which, prevented from being a cadence by the sevenths in French horn, continues to resolve into the tonic which is created by what now appears to be the secondary theme, the main melodic material from the Wayfarer, which was the entire melodic material of the Exposition. With relative ease, the secondary theme comes to an essential closure in D major and is followed by the closing theme. If you'll allow me, I would like to bring in one tiny reference to a one-time program, just because I think it so perfectly describes the coda which ends this movement. Natalie Bauer-Lechner published a book of her conversations and correspondences with Mahler, which, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a hold of. But Konstantin Flores quotes her, quoting Mahler, as saying, "The listener will surely not understand the end of this movement correctly. It will fall into oblivion. Although I could easily have shaped it more effectively. My hero breaks out into laughter and runs away." So that's my analysis of the first movement. Quite a bit more research went into it than usual, and I do want to highlight the work of two scholars whose analyses of this movement, even if they are slightly different than mine, were instrumental in crystallizing my view of the form. And that is Byron Allman and his book A Theory of Musical Narrativity, and Seth Monahan and his book Mahler's Symphonic Sonatas. If you're looking for a university press book to purchase, and honestly, who isn't, either of those would be excellent options. I just want to close by thanking all of my patrons. I really appreciate your support. I am planning to cut out the sections of this video where I analyze the song to post as a teaser on YouTube, and if you'll allow it, I will make this video public on YouTube 1 year after I post it to Patreon. I'm going to continue on with Mahler 1 until the end, and then I may move on to Liszt's Faust Symphony, which a patron recommended for this series. I'm also going to continue to try to do one per month, but as this video is already a week late, I hope you'll give me a little bit of wiggle room in that area. As always, thanks for joining me.